Hello, good afternoon. My name is Jim Capretta. I am a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to today's virtual event on performance assessment and improvement efforts within the federal government. More specifically, we will be looking at federal performance improvement efforts 30 years after the Congress approved the Government Performance and Results Act, or GPRA. For those who may be unfamiliar with GPRA, it was a groundbreaking measure that put into permanent law the expectation that all federal agencies would develop and update clear strategic plans and performance objectives. It also established an annual goal setting and tracking process. My guest for this conversation is Robert Shea, a co-founder of the government relations firm GovNavigators and an expert on strategies for improving management of federal agencies. We are fortunate to have Robert with us today as he has both public and private sector experience relevant to these questions and also understands the significant challenges that have made it difficult to achieve all that was hoped for when GPRA was first conceived. The plan for today is to have Robert provide some short introductory comments and about GPRA and the legacy of that law. After Robert finishes, I will engage him in conversation with questions and perhaps making a few observations myself. There's certainly plenty to discuss here. With about 8 to 10 minutes left, I will turn to a number of audience questions we have received, if we do receive them, during the course of the event and pose them to Robert. So if you would like to have a question considered for this part of the event, you have two options. You can send your suggested question by email to jack.rowing@aei.org. That is jack.rowing, ROWING, @aei.org. Or alternatively, you can send Jack a question via Twitter by using the hashtag AskAEIHealth. Okay, so on to Robert. Let me make a few comments about him, his career, and then we'll turn it over to him for a few minutes. Robert has more than 25 years of experience in support of federal policymaking and public management initiatives. For 7 years, he helped to lead and implement the management improvement agenda for the Bush administration, while serving as an associate director for management at the Office of Management and Budget. In that role, he was part of the team that implemented numerous changes to improve federal performance, including the PART program, which we'll talk about today, and other innovations. I was pleased to be able to serve with Robert as our time in service at OMB crossed over during a portion of those years. Robert is a fellow and a former chairman of the National Academy for Public Administration. He was also appointed to the Commission on Evidence-Based Policymaking, which made important recommendations for better integration of evidence into policymaking. Prior to starting GovNavigators, Robert spent 14 years at Grant Thornton, managing various components of its public sector business practice. In that role, he had extensive contact with management teams at numerous large federal agencies. Robert began his Washington career by working for several years in various staff roles in the House and Senate, including at the Senate Governmental Affairs Committee, where he got to work with the late Senator Fred Thompson, which has oversight of federal management questions and was a source of much of the energy for passing GPRA back in 1993. Robert has a law degree from South Texas College of Law and earned his BA in government at Connecticut College. So, Robert, sorry to hold you up. I want to get right to you at this point. And thank you very much for giving us the time today. Go ahead and make some initial remarks. And after you're done with those, I'll jump into our questions.
Jim, I miss our time working together. So thanks so much for having me on. It's good to be with you.
Thank you.
And thank you even more for that overly generous introduction. So I know you had a hard time finding somebody to talk on this subject, but it has been something I followed since soon after the law was passed. It really represented a seminal moment in government management history. For decades, oversight entities in the Congress, GAO, were lamenting the lack of real clear outcome goals with which to assess government, agency, and program success. So, for the first time, GPRA established the requirement that agencies set long-term outcome-oriented goals and report annually on the extent to which they were accomplishing them. And the implementation of the law was slow to get started as everyone really understood these concepts. That has matured significantly, I would say. There's always a balance between, simply complying with the requirements of a management improvement effort versus really embracing the spirit of the thing. And you can see pockets of agencies, some whole agencies have really embraced this. Others are checking the box or have moved on to different management improvement initiatives. But with the Government Performance and Results Act Modernization Act, the revision that took place during the Obama administration, and then the Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act, among others, you can really see some of the lessons learned through implementation adopted in law and embedded in various regulations and management improvement efforts that are in place today. So, if my major reflection is that the executive branch, Congress, have improved their literacy in performance management. They know the difference between an outcome, an output, and input. And that's really core to all of this. We want agencies and programs focused on what outcomes they're trying to accomplish, not the activities they're performing, but whether or not those activities are contributing to solving some of the country's biggest problems. So it's something I've followed closely. I've worked with many agencies on and look forward to this discussion.
Great. Thank you. That's a good way to tee this up and get going on it. Let's go back to your time in the Bush administration. GPRA had been in place for a little bit less than a decade at that point. And the new administration came in, and there was a lot of energy around trying to take concepts and manage we had an MBA president, right? President Bush had gotten his MBA. So there was a lot of focus on how we're going to manage this vast enterprise a little better. And it wasn't that they set aside GPRA per se, but there was a lot of focus on their own version of how to go about this. And I want to talk about that for just a minute. So when you joined, that was when the PART program was first rolled out. For those who don't remember it, it was something called the Performance Assessment Rating Tool. And it was a way of kind of systematizing in a more scorecard kind of a way the same basic idea of the GPRA is trying to get at, but in a more summary version, maybe. It's sort of quick look at it, questions, and a scoring system. And the idea was to try to be able to measure, I guess, different programs against each other based on the score they received. How do you tell our audience a little bit more about PART, that time, and how do you view its implementation and legacy?
So I had worked closely with the Bush campaign and then transition effort to sort of figure out which were the biggest management challenges facing government. And with the help of GAO and the oversight committees, settled on 5 major buckets: financial management, procurement, human capital management, IT management, and performance. So those were the 5 biggest gaps, at least from GAO's perspective, in the executive branch's management efforts. And so when the Bush administration came in, they designed their management agenda along those pillars, performance improvement being one of them. The thought was at the time, while GPRA had advanced the performance management maturity of the government generally, we didn't really have adequate information to help make decisions at the program level. And so the new folks at OMB and the career staff huddled to figure out how to crack that nut, and arrived at the program assessment rating tool. And it was a simple device. of 25 questions that attempted to ascertain to what extent do you have a clear vision and mission, and or is your program well designed to accomplish it? Do you have outcome-oriented long and short-term goals? Are you well managed? And to what extent do you have data that tells you whether or not you're accomplishing your goals? So over a 5-year period, we assessed every program in the government, assigned a rating to, I should have reminded myself before this meeting, but basically the lowest rating you get is results not demonstrated or ineffective. But other programs generally were, high performing, or not yet able to tell. So it was very controversial because nobody wanted their programs to be assessed so starkly, objectively. But over time, you did get a body of evidence, a first inventory of the government's programs, a single collection of the data it had on whether or not it was performing. And it also, sort of was the catalyst for things like what you see today in the evidence agenda or the Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act. But at the time, the whole machine of OMB and the agencies were focused on gathering the data necessary to answer these key questions about every single program in the executive branch. And I can't say I run into a lot of people who remember that period fondly, but I am proud that we really were able to accomplish that feat in a 5-year plus period, and really set the stage for some of the advancements that we're enjoying today.
The follow-on to that, I think, is to ask a little bit your perspective on maybe this aspect of performance assessment that has always been troublesome and difficult to kind of get at, which is integrating this kind of concept into an incentive system, basically through the budgeting process. The lament really is that the political process tends to budget and provide funding for programs and agencies almost irrespective of how well they're doing. And of course, that's due to maybe a very good reason, which is that these are public agencies doing a public purpose, and you can't judge them on the same standard that you would judge like a private business, which is profitability, right? So there are other reasons to support something, even if maybe it's not working great, right? There might just have an important mission, whatever it is. So the question is, going back to those years, my recollection was that Congress wasn't all that enthusiastic either. And maybe the fact that PART wasn't part of and never was approved by Congress, maybe was part of the reason it had some challenges also. How do you think about this question of in fact, I think we called it at the time, integration of performance and budgeting, right? I mean, how do you think about that, given all the experience you've had in the last quarter century trying to look at these questions? Is that even a feasible possibility, or what could be done to maybe make that work a little better?
We did yeoman's efforts to integrate this process into the budget. So agencies submitted their PART assessment results with their budget justifications to OMB, and they were obligated to integrate the information into their budget justification to Congress. Institutionally speaking, you're right that Congress was not on board with the PART process. There were some enthusiasts, pockets of enthusiasm, usually among Republicans. Appropriators in particular were resistant, even hostile to it. We asked agencies to incorporate the PART results as they were requesting funding for certain programs. And the appropriators in one case in particular, I remember, said, that document is our document. Appropriators see the budget justification as their domain, and for us to dictate the format, even with something so noble as trying to use results to justify investments. They instructed us not to do that. But nonetheless, Congress continues to enact reforms that seek to lift up the kind of information we were trying to send them, but just not in an institutional way. It's not integrated in the appropriations process, not integrated into the budget process overall. Authorizers, in fact, aren't particularly focused on this. The oversight committees remain interested and periodically will hold hearings or enact legislation to tweak these efforts. Ultimately, I think you need a change in the culture that values to a greater degree rigorous evidence of what works. And I said at the time, though nobody believed me, just because you get a failing grade doesn't mean your money should be cut necessarily. It may mean you need more resources. Likewise, a high-performing program that's not a priority may be teed up for a cut. But you generally want to see money move away from low-performing programs and into higher-performing ones. We were able to eliminate some programs that year after year showed poor results, showed under the scrutiny of a rigorous evaluation that they were not only not having the intended impact, but in some cases doing more poorly than if they weren't being served by the program. So in those cases, I think you really are armed with some information that can help you redirect budgets to better ends. Does that help?
Yeah, that does. One just anecdotally from my own experience working in the budgeting process and the executive branch there was that any information that ever came in that said a program was not hitting its metrics or its performance goals generally was a reason for the agency to argue they needed more money.
Yeah, right.
So the idea that they were going to turn around and say, yeah, you're right, we're not doing great, let's cut our budget. That was not generally how it played out, at least internally in the executive branch.
And frankly, irrespective of the program, little constituencies built up around them. And those constituencies, so long as they're benefiting in some way from the program, don't really care that there's some sort of green eye shade data about ineffectiveness. And so those interests sometimes fight pretty hard to protect programs, again, notwithstanding their ineffectiveness.
Right. The other thing I want to get at that has to do with just sort of the revolution that the private sector has gone through in the last 3 decades with information technology really transforming many industries and businesses. And at Grant Thornton, you probably had some window into kind of both a public and a private sector kind of window, which is a good perspective maybe to also have for this conversation. But my question really gets to, I think sometimes people don't really understand the scale of the federal enterprise and all the things it's doing. It's, I think, 2 million or so direct employees and, another 6 or 8 million contractors. So, you're talking maybe 10 million people out there working in and around the federal enterprise. And, just almost every aspect of American life, there's some federal agency or program that's intersecting with what's going on. And so it's a big operation out there. And many agencies with big IT budgets too, trying to serve the public in the various ways they're doing. But, our experience, I know you remember it from those days, it's a challenge sometimes in the federal contracting world to do these projects right. And one, just objectively looking back, looking at the federal government relative to the private sector and how it's changed in the last 30 years or so. I guess one would say that it seems like private businesses have been more revolutionized by the information technology changes underway than interacting with the public services in the federal government. That would be my impression, which is obviously an impression, not hard evidence. How do you see that? I mean, is the federal government fully taking advantage of the possibilities of serving the public better through information technology are things that could be streamlined and made easier for people that just are not happening for various reasons. What is your perspective on all that?
That's a pretty easy question. Although the bottom line is the private sector is not taking adequate advantage of these innovations, but it's true that the federal government is even slower. I will say the advancements that the American people have made with the help of the federal government are incredible. Our human health, innovation in the health industry, the technology advancements you talk about, in industry in area of our society, the contributions that the federal government has made are incredible. But it's also true that they are very slow to adopt reforms, and inefficiency, waste are still major challenges, major barriers to greater success. It's much harder to hire someone in the federal government. It's an intractable problem that I can't fathom why it hasn't been solved, at least to a better degree. It's harder still to hold someone accountable for their performance. Firing, the survey, every annual survey of federal employees shows that the employees themselves think that we're not doing a good job holding individuals accountable, holding poor performers accountable for their performance. But also acquisition is slow. And it's important to note that an industry doing business with the federal government has to guarantee that it's offering the government the lowest price. So it makes it less attractive, frankly, to do business with the federal government, not to mention the myriad requirements that you have to comply with in order just to bid on a project. And you mentioned IT projects. If you can get over the ability to hire a workforce able to manage them, and then get the contract signed to purchase them, implementing them is not a strength of the federal government. Time and time again, we pull the plug after billions have been invested for some innovation. Those are areas that remain, those are management challenges that have not been solved for the federal government. And we should continue to hack away at those things. It doesn't mean these aren't getting done. I think when they do get done, when a robotic process automation initiative unleashes hours of time saved, then we really ought to step back and say, what distinguished that from others? I'm actively involved with the Agile Government Center at the National Academy of Public Administration. That's exactly what that intends to do, really highlight what are the agile practices that distinguish successful projects from unsuccessful ones, and how do we share more quickly those kinds of practices so that they can really help in a culture change across government to be more adept, more nimble at getting some of these things done.
That's very helpful. Get to I'm getting to a hypothetical here, which is, imagine if you're a federal manager and you're running something that takes 1,000 people right now, and then an IT innovation comes along that allows you to interface with your customers in a way that makes it possible. Just objectively, you could have 500 people doing the same thing instead of 1,000. Is there a fundamental problem here where that manager or that agency overseeing that manager and those workers, they obviously have a little bit of a disincentive to downsize their agency from 1,000 to 500 workers, even if the IT does serve the customer better? Is there a way to solve that? How could we incentivize? The agencies, and this is not intended to be disparaging of what the agencies are up to. It's just a human nature question of, can we ever incentivize the agencies to substitute a little bit of technology for manpower? Is that something that's even easy to do at this point?
Well, one of the things the federal government has going for it, I'm not sure that's the right way to couch that, but is that there's a lot more mission to be accomplished than we have people or money to do it with. So if you can free up resources, there's more to be done elsewhere. I think it's a real question of leadership. And you know this better than most, that a lot of executives enter government not interested in the machinery of government, but more in the policy or the mission of the organizations. But they should, a leader that wants those missions accomplished is well served by focusing or investing in the right people, the ability to crack that nut, to focus on fixing government. I'm aware of an initiative at the General Services Administration where they established a automation center of excellence. And they said there was a competition basically by who could save the most hours by improving operations. And you see there much greater success at automation than in other places across government, because the leadership made it a priority. They assigned responsibility to the project, the people with the background and skills to oversee it. And then they sort of radiated accountability for it, not saying precisely how you ought to accomplish these efficiency goals, but nonetheless setting targets and asking everyone to pony up. And so you've got the results of those show, just tremendous savings in time and money. GSA is a small agency, probably not, a good comparison to the Department of Defense or Homeland Security. Nonetheless, I think that sort of centralized governance, accountability, but also tailored approach, letting the people who know the business the most figure out how to accomplish those efficiency goals is a good way to get it done. You're right to point out that a savings in hours might mean the ability to do it with fewer people. And it takes a committed management leadership to undertake that and take the hard steps to reassign or reduce those workforces.
That's interesting. Going back just very quickly on this, on sort of the same concept, going back a few years, there was something along these lines in the Clinton era that Vice President Gore at that time headed up, as people might remember, the National Performance Review, which was really a concerted effort to take a lot of these ideas and put them into practice and test new things, and give that administration credit for taking a lot of these questions pretty seriously. And they came up with a concept that was trying to get this thing, sort of the idea you had with the GSA there, sort of a performance-based incentive system for an agency to try to encourage people to pony up and take on some of these management challenges, save the money, and then maybe redeploy it elsewhere, basically inside an agency. Is that a concept that people might want to resurrect? Is it? I know it takes a lot of control out of the hands of Congress, and they don't like that, but because it maybe makes the annual appropriation process a little bit less binding. But what do you think of that whole idea?
Well, I mean, I think it's a great idea, and you see this at Student Financial Aid. They're a high-performing organization, and you've got various flexibilities that other agencies don't enjoy. I talked about the difficulty hiring, holding people accountable, the difficulty in acquisition, difficulty implementing IT. An organization that had flexibility outside of those existing requirements should be able to operate more efficiently. You see the same thing at fee-funded organizations. Those organizations that have to survive on the fees they collect are incented to operate as efficiently as possible. And so I do think introducing those business concepts where appropriate can unlock efficiencies. And I think you could get into a situation where those organizations have to earn those flexibilities on a regular basis, demonstrate that they're operating them, they're leveraging them. First of all, often when you give organizations flexibility, they don't take advantage of them. You don't want to excuse somebody from the strictures of Title V and then not see them improve hiring and accountability.
Right.
Then you want to see that those flexibilities are being used to good result. And if not, I think that's a good argument for removing them. So maybe a periodic sunsetting of those flexibilities and a sort of a reflection on whether or not they deserve to be renewed.
As you know, I like that idea because we've kind of communicated about it. And so, yeah, thank you for.
I'm sucking up to my host.
Right. No, that's
hope
great.
it's not too obvious.
But of course, it does require going to Congress. And that is, of course, another thing, which is that I do think, and get your reaction to this, that having Congress be engaged in this a little bit more and to take management of the vast enterprise that's been created by laws over the years as seriously as possible. No one's looking for miracles here, but because it is a public enterprise and it has lots of pressures on it that go beyond just sort of profit making, so to speak. I mean, there are reasons why the government has to have the rules it has and so on, because it's serving everybody. So I get that. Everybody gets that. But the question is, can we get our Congress to even be a little bit more interested in this and create these kinds of creative ideas inside the apparatus so that the public is served a little better by innovations.
Right.
And so the question is, who did you go to in the Congress? This is maybe cutting against your history on the Hill, which is the Government Affairs Committee, the Government Oversight Committee, working with GAO. They tended to be the committees that were most interested in this, and they done a lot of good work over the years. Can we get the appropriators and the Ways and Means and Finance Committee, where all the money is? How do we get those? Maybe we could try to go to those committees and see if we can get them interested. Is that an idea? I mean, especially the appropriators.
Well, I think the way the Clinton administration did it was there was an omnibus piece of legislation that authorized them to pick pilots. And that way, pilot's not a very scary term. Temporary,
Yeah.
could go away quickly. And so that's an idea. It's incumbent on the organizations seeking the flexibility to argue the basis for it. I loathe the fact that Congress and the executive branch don't have a better working relationship. And if there's a barrier of the legislative affairs offices and agencies, hopefully we can dissolve that and create some forum by which there can be an open sharing of challenges and solutions.
Right.
If
checks and balances doesn't need to mean complete dysfunction, right? There should be a little bit more cooperation, right?
Exactly right. And just more conversation, I think, is gonna mean for a much better working relationship. Yeah, I think on an authorizing committee by authorizing committee, you're probably going to have a better chance of doing that. You'll have to overcome jurisdictional objections, which is why it's probably important to bring the oversight committees along, because it's sort of their domain.
Yeah.
But I think having these conversations and making sure you've got adequate justification. During the Trump administration, they had a great initiative to proliferate reorganizations, and unfortunately the justifications that were used to drive those were just grossly inadequate. Not collaborating with Congress, not having good justifications for why they needed these organizations or flexibilities. It's just death. And it's not rocket science. Basically stepping back, what are you trying to accomplish? How is what you're requesting going to help you accomplish that? And by what measure are you going to report your success?
Yeah. So Congress never took any of them up, basically.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
And when the administration was called to argue for their approval, it was kind of embarrassing.
Yeah, right. Well, let's bring ourselves up to the follow-on administration, the Biden administration, which is sort of where we are right now. And obviously they've had, like any administration, this is true of the Bush administration you and I worked in, and every administration, their priority is policy, right? And so management is can be very important, but it's not something that you're going to have a president or even the vice president speaking on very often, right?
Right.
They're focused on trying to change some of the major policies of the country. So having said that, though, every new administration, and maybe somewhat give yourself a little credit, the president's management agenda that was rolled out in the early Bush years kind of became a template. Every administration tries to do some things now. Where are we with the Biden administration? What are they trying to do in this area of improved federal performance?
So, the Biden administration has a three-pronged president's management agenda, and you're right, they did keep that framing concept and announced within a year of the president's inauguration a three-pronged agenda focused on improving the customer experience so that we make it easier, especially for the traditionally underserved populations, to access government's benefits and services. The human capital is the main priority of the initiative, trying to fix some of the major human capital challenges we discussed, and then a broader umbrella business of government. So acquisition, financial management fall into that bucket. And according to amendments to the Government Performance Results Act, called the Government's Performance Results Act Modernization Act, they report quarterly on the extent to which they're achieving some big goals, both government-wide priority goals, cross-agency priority goals, they're called, or high priority goals. What are the big goals agencies are trying to accomplish? They report that quarterly on performance.gov. I'm not sure it's at the level of clarity or transparency that I would hope, but nonetheless, a lot of the things that you and I were working on back in the day, I don't mean to raise our age again, but have been sustained across administrations. The thing I'm most excited about is evidence-based policymaking. This focus on rigorous evaluation of programs to ascertain what works best and lifting those up. There's been a major transformation in the governance of those activities.
That's a terrific development. We haven't really touched on it very much today, and very much related to this whole performance focus is there's certain things going on that maybe are just not, delivering much by way of results at all. That's not to say that the goal that they set out in Congress when they created it wasn't worthy. The question is whether continuing with the program that's sitting there is really going to do it, and whether maybe something else might work a little better, and getting the policy community to shift it around and focus on a different avenue toward the same goal. We do have a question that's come in from the audience I want to ask you right now, and then I'll have a couple more for myself. But the question is, who is ultimately responsible for implementing, this is a great question for those who are just not as familiar with the law, for implementing the mandates of the Government Performance and Results Act and reporting on its results? Who's in charge of making this happen, so to speak, and making sure it's done according to the law? And then what involvement does GAO and OMB have with implementing and overseeing the GPRA?
So at each agency, there's a performance improvement officer with responsibility for implementing the Government Performance and Results Act. Generally small staffs that coordinate across the departments and agencies, collecting and reporting the data required under the Act. The overall requirements for implementation are found in OMB Circular A11, which should be coming out any day now. It sets the requirements for agencies' annual performance planning and reporting, and the integration of that information into congressional budget justifications. That the office that oversees that effort at OMB is called the Office of Performance and Personnel Management, OPPM. And then, of course, GAO very helpfully reviews agency and OMB implementation of the requirements of GPRA and reports regularly. One of the favorite things that GAO does in this arena is a periodic survey of program managers, and we haven't seen good results in program manager use of performance data to make decisions. It has crept up, but not at a pace that I think would allow us to call this success. And so, but it's a very good benchmark in requiring us to assess where we are and what tweaks we can make to sort of embed performance management more and more into the culture of agencies.
Great. I want to go to a question a little bit more philosophical from your perspective, and then also biographical questions. I got two really teed up here. One is
I feel like I should lie down.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Given where you've been, sort of what if you had to list three things that Congress might want to take on and think about, and maybe OMB, the next, the current OMB director, maybe the next one in 2025. What kind of things would you say might make a big difference if we could kind of get political agreement around moving forward on something? Are there any things that are on your wish list of things we should put into law, or just, beyond?
Yeah.
I mean, of course, commitment by the leadership is important, but what do we need to do to change systematically to kind of maybe make improvements on all the different laws that are already there?
Right. It's a great question. At the end of the Trump administration, they ripped up all of these performance management requirements by the roots, which I think was a little dramatic. But I do think a reflection on whether or not the requirements we impose on agencies that flow from these laws are actually producing the desired results, or whether some greater flexibility might be in order. So I think that reflection is in order. Greater flexibility for agencies. OMB and the Congress impose more and more management improvement requirements on agencies and generally apply them across the board in a pretty cookie cutter approach. I think a more flexible way would be to allow agencies to pick and choose which initiatives are most applicable, which ones are most necessary to address their genuine challenges, what's keeping them from accomplishing their mission. Might be a better way to accomplish what we're trying to achieve. And then finally, this might make you laugh, but everybody should be asking more and more, whether it's in a strategic planning session at the beginning of administration or at an everyday staff meeting, what are we trying to accomplish? And I'm parroting
surprisingly how little that question's asked. Right?
I'm parroting my old boss Clay Johnson, but we really don't do it enough. What are we trying to accomplish, and how do we know we're going to get there?
Yeah, right.
That Congress ought to ask it more, OMB ought to ask it more, agency leadership managers ought to be asking it more.
That's a great point. Back to some biographical type question, which I waited till the end for it, which is, you probably, like many of us, you come to Washington, you start at the Government Affairs Committee. How did you end up doing this? How I know it's been satisfying, but give us a little sense of whether the work has turned out as you thought it would when you got started, and how do you reflect back on working in this area?
That's it. I can't imagine that this is where this is the script I would have written.
Yeah.
But I do remember as a kid, it's gonna make you roll your eyes, reading the President's Private Sector Survey on Cost Control.
For those who don't know, that was the Reagan administration.
My grandfather was a longtime W. Grace employee, and he sent us all copies of the Grace Commission report, and I did a report on it in junior high school. So I do think this sort of gave me a slight interest in this area. And then fast forward to the 90s, where I landed on the House Committee on Government Reform and Oversight.
Yeah.
And that was right as GAO was getting reauthorized and GPRA was first being implemented. Both those initiatives sort of gave me a PhD in the operation of the executive branch that kept it interesting since that day.
Great. It's a great way to get into this whole business. Yeah. Good. I didn't know the story about the Grace report. So Many people probably read it in the 1980s, but I can say you probably are one of the few that and working in this area now who has read it. So that's terrific. Well, we are at time, and I want to end right on time with our guest, Robert. Thank you very much. I hope the conversation has been as useful to our audience as it was to me, and I am very grateful that you were willing to join me for this event. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
You're welcome.